What's the point thinking you're good enough? There's always someone who's going to be better. I'm a straight A student. I'm doing well in school. I have friends. One of my friends had actually called the police after I made a suicide attempt when I was 16. Can you look up how many of this one drug it takes for me to die? I'm just taking up oxygen that other people can be breathing. When I woke up, I was in a mental hospital.
Dear family and friends, I've had enough. Life is just too hard for me. I've tried to be an awesome kid, tried to be a good friend, a good cousin, and a good kid, but nothing is enough. I try so hard in school, but I just can't make it. Life is just tough, and I have to leave. I have to go. There's no way out. I'm sorry. I love you. This is an example of a suicide note that can be written by a 10-year-old, a 15-year-old, or a 20-year-old. And we sit there reading, wondering, what could we have done? Well, today we're going to be talking to Emily. Emily is a suicide survivor.
Born and brought up in the Bay Area of California, an extremely competitive and sometimes toxic school environment, Emily Herr was only 11 years old when she attempted to take her life away. 1 in 5 people face mental health illnesses, yet we never imagined that we could possibly fall under that statistic, yet alone a straight A student and valedictorian like Emily. Battling depression, anxiety, and eating disorders, Emily is that 20% of people who struggles on a daily basis to simply live with herself. For the past year, she has been working towards publishing her very own book, Everything I Leave Behind for You, where she shares her story and the lessons she learned along the way.
She will relate to a lot of high-performing students who feel that way. Now trending are conversations about Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles, who've chosen to take a mental health break when they're in the pinnacle of success. But what is a pinnacle of success if your mental health is not in the proper form? So let's talk candidly today about survivors of suicide.
Join us today as we uncover the root causes of Emily's struggles and break the stigma of mental health.
As you all know, viewer discretion is advised for this piece.
Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button down below and leave us a comment of what you'd like to see next.
Well, Emily, thank you very much again for joining us. We're so honored to have you, because the topic that you're going to talk about and be authentic about is a very serious topic that not people are starting to talk about, but not yet out there. And it's primarily about mental health and resilience. So just so that you resonate with a couple of our audience members, mainly Gen Zs and their parents, can you talk to us about how your household is? What is your family structure like, just starting off?
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up in the Bay Area in California, so right in the heart of Silicon Valley. I had a mother and a father in my household, as well as an older brother 2 years older than me. And my parents are immigrants from Taiwan. And so generally that was how my household structure was. Would say definitely, growing up, it was the very typical, very stereotypical kind of East Asian parental kinds of methods that they had used to raise me and my brother. And so I think that definitely contributed a lot to my experience with mental health growing up.
Right. So, I mean, you talked about your childhood and the mentality. So can you give us stories about some areas of your upbringing, about your childhood, so that we can resonate with our audience?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So I grew up in a very competitive environment, essentially, just coming out of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley. My high school, I don't want to use the word toxic because that word is probably overused right now, but it was definitely a very competitive kind of place to be in. And not just high school, it's also starting in middle school. It always felt like, nothing you ever did was good enough. The pressure wasn't just from parents, but also definitely from a lot of peers that you were surrounded by, to the point where you start internalizing that. You start questioning yourself a lot, wondering if you're ever good enough, and then starting to believe and doubt yourself that you never are good enough. Constantly being told by, not just my parents, but the people around me that, there's always somebody who's going to be better than you, so what's the point in giving up now? What's the point thinking you're good enough? There's always someone who's going to be better. And so you keep on pushing yourself, and essentially that's just kind of how I grew up. It wasn't just in academics, but practically in everything I did in my life. It always felt like there was a glass ceiling that just kept on moving higher, the higher that I moved as well. It felt like the better I was at things, the more expectations were placed on me. Once again, not just by family, but by my community. I felt like, if you're able to prove yourself that you can do this, you might as well be able to do that. Because if you can't do the other thing, then are you really as smart? Are you really as capable as you like to think that you are? And, just growing up, it starts to really affect your self-esteem. It really starts to affect your self-confidence and how you really value yourself. You start to place value on yourself based off of definitions of other people that you kind of just grew up around, So growing up in the Bay Area, a lot of the definition came from academics and just how good you are, especially in STEM topics. And so growing up, I was somebody who was very interested in the arts instead. And I've always been very interested in visual arts, creative arts, anything in that form. But that just wasn't really something valued compared to the fact that I was a little bit at math. And so, my parents and my school really pushed me to continue down that pathway of like math, of statistics, but like the arts were never cared about, and didn't matter how good you were at art. If you weren't good at STEM, then you were probably close to being of little value within that kind of community. And so, yeah, I think all of these together, not just family, but just the community as well, really add to just an adolescent or just somebody who's going through puberty, somebody who's growing up. It really does affect how they end up seeing themselves later on in their lives.
And did the same kind of pressure happen to your brother as well, because he's in the same family? Did you find that? Or was it just
I actually found that, so I'm not trying to expose anybody here, but I found that it definitely didn't happen to my brother at all, because I think just within my family, I had proved since a young age that I was a lot more, I guess, capable and interested in academics. Just naturally, I'm somebody who enjoys learning. I enjoy, being curious, and that just happened to align with academics as well. And so I think when my parents came to realize that, hey, I was the child who it's like very interested in academics already, like I was the one who I felt was pushed to greater depths than my brother was growing up. I was the one who, despite him being 2 years older than me, I was the one who had to take advanced SAT classes just to be tutoring him when I was in middle school. I was the one who had to be pushed years ahead just because like I was capable of it. And that's where, like I earlier mentioned, it felt like the better I was doing, the more expectations were therefore put on me, and the higher and further those expectations became. And so, like one thing led to another, and it just, once again, just really compounds on the feeling of never being able to feel like you were good enough, even though, when you step back from reality, you're probably already within like the top 10 or 5% of adolescents within America.
Right. And you obviously felt the pressure. You might have even normalized the pressures, and this is an expectation. But at what point did you realize I need a break, or I'm having mental health issues, is what you mentioned at some point. When did you come to realize it? And how was your day? Like, how did your day go through when you realized that you had mental health issues?
Honestly, I don't think I realized, I don't think I completely accepted that I had mental health issues until late into high school. But I was first told that I had mental health issues early middle school, about when I was 11 years old. I was told by a very close friend at the time. It was like, hey, Emily, it's not normal for 11-year-olds to be cutting themselves at night. It's not normal for them to like cry themselves to sleep because of the SAT. Like, you're 11 years old, for Christ's sake. It was stuff like that. And, my friend just kind of brought it up to me. He's like, hey, like, we learned about depression in class today. Like, like, I think you might be depressed. But kind of growing up in a community where mental health really wasn't a conversation that was ever had, and learning about mental health disorders in classes felt a lot like, these are just disorders that other people have. They exist for sure, but, it's another person's problem. It's never going to be my problem, kind of thing. And so even when I heard it, it was like, oh, no, like that's never going to affect me. I'm not like that. I'm a straight A student. I'm doing well in school. I have friends. There's no way there's anything wrong with me like that, because you hear the stereotypical examples that somebody with mental health disorders, they're antisocial, they're not successful, they can't function by themselves. You hear all these like stereotypes, making it as a child very difficult to realize that it's okay to be successful in the very common colloquial term, but still suffer from these kinds of issues. So middle school, when I first was told that I didn't really believe it. It was funny that even after my first suicide attempt at 12 years old, I still wasn't able to fully accept that, because to me, I told myself, like, no, you don't actually have issues. People who have issues go through so much worse than you do. You have a roof over your head, you have 3 meals a day. you are just like weak, like you just can't take on the pressure that everyone else around you is doing fine with, you're just like, you essentially are just like not as capable as everyone else. Like you're doing this to yourself. And so I never was even able to accept that I had a problem until I was about in high school, when I think I just reached a point. It's really hard to really describe how I even came to accept it. But I just reached a point where I just was told by so many people in my life, by like counselors, by friends, by just even strangers, they're like, hey, like there is something wrong with you. And like, there's nothing wrong with that, but you should probably like get help for that. And like, it's okay to get help. And I think it wasn't until I finally began accepting that people with mental disorders are just as quote unquote normal as everyone else in society that I started to accept that myself. And yeah, once like I figured out that essentially I had disorders, essentially that there might be something, not as, I guess, like not as straight in my head, I realized like, hey, like, I guess like, first of all, like, it's okay that I'm like this. Like, this is just kind of how the reality of things are. And honestly, like, might as well get some help for it. And I say it very easily now, but it definitely wasn't that easy to accept at first. When I first realized and started accepting that I did have issues, there were still times when I doubt myself. Even now, sometimes I still kind of gaslight myself and question, like, did I really go through those things, or was I just really weak? You start questioning yourself a lot. And I think it took a long, long time before I was able to actually get help. And even then, I didn't willfully choose to get help. One of my friends had actually called the police after I made a suicide attempt when I was 16. And because I had overdosed, it started affecting my body immediately. And after she called the police, I was taken away on like an ambulance straight to an emergency room in a hospital. I passed out for a little bit. And when I woke up, I was in a mental hospital. And I was just like, being a minor, you're kind of held against your will, against like voluntary volition in a mental hospital. So I like ended up getting help, but I didn't willingly go for that help. And it was honestly after that mental hospital and just being confined in that area for the period of time that I was in that I started to learn that it was okay to heal. It was okay to need to heal. And it was okay to, maybe take a few slower steps than everyone else looks like they're doing.
And if I could just dig deeper into, take you back to that 11-year-old self, when you said you cut yourself and you attempted suicide at the age of 12, but you also normalized it. So I'd like to go through those steps. So at the age of 11, what were you thinking? Were you thinking, I did not get a particular grade, and so therefore this is my only option? I'd like to understand what drove you to cut yourself, what drove you to try to commit suicide at the age of 12.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think it might be easiest to just go with examples in particular. And so like you mentioned just now, like, let's say I was in a situation where maybe I didn't get the grade that I wanted on maybe just like, let's say an exam. And so like, kind of like my mental process would be like, hey, look, like I didn't do as well, but I see like my friends doing really well on this exam, So first of all, this is a me problem, it's not like it was really hard for everybody. It was just me. So obviously I did badly. And honestly, it might be kind of a self-centered way of thinking of it, but I would think like, okay, like I did this wrong. Wow, like I should have spent more time studying, maybe if I didn't like sleep that extra hour, maybe if I didn't go with my friends last Friday, maybe if I like didn't read that extra chapter in a novel that I wanted to read, maybe if I just spent like, even if it was just a few extra minutes studying, maybe I could have like gotten my score up better. And it's all these like small things that I would find that was wrong with my life, all these small little areas that I could have done better in. And so growing up, you start to really examine and really kind of fine tune and focus on every single small thing you do, and just gets so exhausting after a while. You never let yourself break because you think like on this exam that I'm going to have next Friday, if I take a break now, it could cost me like a few points. And that could be like the deciding factor between like an A or an A minus. And like, obviously it's probably laughable to some people, but to me, like it was very intense back then. And it was just every single moment I needed to be productive as possible. And once again, it's just very exhausting, very taxing, not only mentally, but also physically, like not letting yourself have a break, always trying to cram and like do as much as you can. And so for me, like what led to my suicide attempt, honestly, like it was a culmination of a lot of big life events happening, as well as all of these smaller life events, almost like being the last straw on the camel's back of sorts. And so in terms of big life events happening, at that point, my parents were fighting a lot. So home life just wasn't so great for me. And I didn't feel very safe at home. I felt a lot of pressure at school. I wasn't doing so well in an accelerated math class that I was in. And, even though it might be laughable now, at that point in my life, it was almost my entire world to be able to do well in academics. When I was 12 as well, I was also sexually harassed for the first time in my life. And it was actually from somebody who was a very close friend to me. And after that experience, it's just really hard because it was also one of the first people in my life who told me that I might suffer from mental disorders. And so they were a very big support pillar in my life. And for them to have done that to me at that point in my life, it just kind of felt like I hit a lot of lows where it was like, what's the point of even living anymore? I feel like I'm just taking up space. I'm not doing well at all. I'm just like taking up oxygen that other people can be breathing. And so I just felt no purpose in my life. And also to a point where, it just felt like killing yourself might as well just be an escape from everything. It felt like there's too much going on. I didn't want to wake up anymore. And it felt like peace and escape felt so much better than just waking up one more morning.
And if I can ask you, did your parents even know? Did your brother at that point know that you were trying to cut yourself? Did they notice that? When you attempted at the age of 12, did they notice anything and ask you questions about it?
I think I was very good at hiding it, to be very honest, because at school, once again, I was kind of that straight A student. Like my friends used to joke that I was kind of the model student, teacher's pet, that like everybody, like every parent probably wanted their kid to be like, but it was behind the scenes, that wasn't really how I was feeling. And I was able to keep that front up even with my parents. I was able to, because to my parents, it was like, look, she might not be smiling all the time, but her grades are still okay, which means she's doing okay. She's still eating, she's still sleeping, she's still coming home from school, she's doing okay. And I think obviously it did come out in small ways in my lifestyle. So it might just be, I was smiling less, I was crying more. I used to have anxiety attacks. So I might like scream hours until the night. Of course, those were obvious. But I think at a certain point, my parents might have just started attributing it to, like she's just growing up, she's just under a lot of pressure, but she's still fine. She needs to learn to be able to take this on. It's stressful, but like she has to just like toughen up pretty much. And so my parents didn't really do much about that. Honestly, like my brother and I have always had a very strained relationship. And so he honestly didn't care too much about like what I was going through. And to him, it was never anything serious because he didn't really understand the kind of pressure that I was going through. So to him, it just looked, once again, similar to my parents, that, Emily just can't take the pressure and she needs to learn how to toughen up to it. And so I did eventually tell my parents about my first suicide attempt, like a few weeks after like the attempt I took when I was 12. And I'm not trying to blame my parents. I do understand that they came from a place in a country where, mental health really wasn't a conversation that they actively had. But I do remember the first time I told my parents that I wanted to kill myself and I had tried to kill myself, their response was simply just like, oh, like you're too weak, like you're just being a coward. You aren't facing up to the pressure that everyone else around you is able to do. We went through this when we were your age. How come you're like this? How come no one else is trying to kill themselves and you're here? Why are you like this? This is your fault. Like you're just weak. You're emotionally unstable. Like you're being a coward to the world. They said a lot more things than just that. But once again, I'm not trying to blame my parents because I understand that where they grew up, it was very different. They didn't have these kinds of encouraging conversations about mental health. That was the only way they knew how to approach it. But obviously, as somebody who was 12 years old, trying to tell your parents that you had tried to kill yourself, it was very effective to me and my relationship thereon with my parents, and especially how I approached the topic of mental health with them.
Wow. And if you're okay to share, where do you think that your relationship with your brother, the strained relationship with your brother started off? What was it in the family dynamics that caused it? And how did that impact your mental health even further?
That's a very interesting question, actually. Not many people ask that, like where it started from, but I want to say that it probably did start as young as I can remember, because I remember growing up and my parents used to fight very frequently. They used to fight a lot because of my brother's academics, the fact that he wasn't somebody who, cared as much about school, therefore he didn't do as well. And they used to always fight all the time because my parents had different approaches to education for children, just growing up in different families. And so they would fight all the time about how to best approach education for my brother, who was somebody who was very reluctant and very stubborn and resistant to learning. I remember growing up and being very scared of these fights and being very scared of the loud noises, of all the banging and the clashing and everything going on. And just like crying to myself, I would always think that I'm going to make sure that I'm not like my brother. I'm going to do everything that he is not doing. I'm just not going to be him because I don't want to add to this kind of terror that I'm having in my own home. And so I think growing up, essentially a lot of what I put on myself really came from a place of, I just want to do everything I can to prevent my parents from fighting even more. I'm going to be like the perfect child. I'm going to be like that trophy child in school, who's doing well in school, who has friends who like other parents compare their child to. Like, I'm going to be that kid. So like my parents don't need to fight even more for me, because that was just so scary for me. And I think growing up, as I began to kind of really develop and become this kind of person that I was becoming, I started to notice just how opposite, of course, I was from my brother. And, noticing his opposite tendencies, noticing what he was doing that was literally quite the opposite of me. It made me like essentially like dislike him very strongly, because I found myself having to be a lot more mature than my age at many periods in my life, just to be able to kind of take on the kinds of stress that I was having at home, alongside with school, alongside with like the jobs that I was holding. And so I like, as we started to just drift apart further and further in our lifestyles and where we became, I just started disliking him even more and more, because the fact that he would never understand that our parents were fighting because of him, the fact that he never needed to kind of go through what I went through despite growing up in the same household, and him like never understanding where I was coming from, never understanding how difficult it was for me growing up compared to him. That was very stressful for me. And obviously there were one-off incidences in my life where my brother did like questionable things to me that like very much questioned my humanity in him, which you could now point to him being immature, but at the same time it still affected my mental health very greatly, how he had treated me as a child, just being like the younger sister who doesn't know as much as like the older brother. He really put me down a lot growing up, despite the fact that I knew I was in classes more advanced than he was. He used to like yell at me when I was having my anxiety attacks, that I was just being loud and noisy and I wanted attention. And he would do a bunch of things that I don't think completely affected my mental health, but instead just grew towards animosity towards him as a child.
Wow, this is quite heavy. I mean, in regards to what you had to go through with your family and with your brother. We touched upon your struggles, and one of the areas that I'd like to talk more into is when you attempted suicide at the age of 16, and you said that a friend called in and reported it. Now, can you walk through that day with us to understand how a friend was aware of your overdose?
I think I have to take the story back a few days, actually, because prior to this day in particular, I had run away from home for about a week. And so I was staying at a different friend's place, mentally already wasn't doing so great because I was putting up a front at school, acting like everything was going okay, when really I had run away, and like I was staying at a different friend's place. And like my mom was coming over every day trying to convince me to go back, and I was refusing. There's just a lot going on while I was exhausted putting up a front at school. And so at one point, I just started feeling like a burden to my friend. I can't stay that long unannounced at a friend's place. I was like, okay, like I'll go back now. Thank you so much for your hospitality. Can't stay any much longer without it just being too much for you guys. And so I went home that day, and, just coming home, of course, as expected, my parents like blew up on me. They exploded, like, like you were such a burden to your friend. Why'd you run away for that long? Blah, 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 blah. Like, you're just doing everything wrong, blah, blah, like, like the usual that you get there. And that day I was just incredibly just mentally like not in a good place at all. And so I had walked myself up to my room, and I had some painkillers in like one of my desk drawers. And I was texting a friend at the time, just kind of talking to her. She was my best friend at the time. And so I was just telling her, like everything that's going on that day. She already knew like mentally wasn't in a great place. And I was just texting her, talking to her. She was trying to calm me down. And at one point I just kind of texted her. I was like, hey, can you do me a favor? Can you look up how many of this like one drug it takes for me to die? And then her response was just like, Emily, like, what did you do? And I didn't respond from there because I had already just like taken a fistful of whatever I took. And at that point, like when I didn't respond, she never said anything after that. Like the next thing I knew, the police were at my door. And so she probably had assumed within that time period that I had overdosed. The fact that I wasn't responding because she just kind of knew like how I talk and like how I text. The fact that I didn't respond, she knew like I had done something. And so she immediately called 911, kind of just told them like, at least this is her recollection back to me. She told them that her friend had just overdosed, gave them my address. And like next thing I knew, there were like police and ambulance siren at my door. My parents were super confused because like they didn't know I had overdosed upstairs, and like all of a sudden the police are at the door. They just kind of like barge in through the front door, like past my parents and up the stairs. Somehow they knew where my bedroom was. They found me in my bedroom. And they just looked like they only asked me, they were like, did you overdose? And I said, yeah, I did. And the next thing, they had taken me away on a stretcher, like down the stairs and out the door. And it was honestly such a blur. I don't know if it's because I was overwhelmed, so I don't remember as much, or if it's because like my mind has subconsciously decided to block that out of my memory. But that's about as much as I remember. I remember like bits and details from here and there, just being in the ambulance and like looking around and seeing so many people staring at me in the ambulance, and like looking at like all the buttons around the ambulance and being fascinated by that. But then also, reaching the hospital and the ER and like not really knowing why I was there, being questioned by the police, and then like passing out every now and then. I don't know if I actually passed out from exhaustion, if it was because the drugs were overtaking my system, if it was just because like my mind just had too much going on, and just for my own safety it decided to shut me down. I'm not too sure, but I do remember passing out and like coming to consciousness every now and then for a few minutes, and passing out again for who knows how long, because I also had no sense of time at that point. But then at one point, I just kind of woke up after passing out for a few hours. I think I woke up and I was in a strange room, and I found out I was in a mental hospital. That's where it all began.
Wow. And how long were you in the mental hospital?
I honestly do not remember anymore. And once again, that's something like, I don't know if it's because I subconsciously am trying not to remember, or if it's just that I have a horrible memory and I'm trying not to remember. But I do know it was at least a week. And so I guess like, just to kind of explain it, by California law, if you are like at danger of yourself or of anybody else, then you could be involuntarily held in a mental hospital for 72 hours. But when you're in there in the 72 hours, if the doctor in-house decides that you're still not stable enough to return back to society, they can keep you in there for up to, I want to say 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I believe. And so that was pretty much my situation. I started out as, just being on a 72-hour hold, but I had a breakdown in the hospital. And so they decided to keep me for a bit longer. And just being in the hospital, you really have no sense of time, because you are shielded from the outside world, essentially. Like all you know is the hospital for your time there. And so I had no sense of time when I was within the hospital, and coming out, I don't particularly remember how long I had known I was in the hospital. So that could attribute to part of the hazy memory there.
So after getting hospitalized, you mentioned you went through therapy, I believe. What was your experience like with therapy, and if you would recommend it to others?
Yeah, definitely. So I have quite the history with therapy. I was first forced to see therapy when I was first diagnosed with depression. Just by like the hospital, I was required to go to see therapy. And like just being a minor and seeing therapy is a bit of a sticky situation, in my opinion, because my parents were always present in the therapy sessions. So, I didn't really want to open up myself to a therapist who I felt like was being paid to talk to me once a week with my parents in the same room. That just makes me uncomfortable. Like, I'm not going to talk to you at that point. And so, my first impression of therapy was already not so great. After going to the mental hospital and coming out of it again, I was once again forced to see therapy. But at that point, they had realized that was the previous problem I had with therapy. So it allowed me to have more private sessions of therapy. But to be very honest, I think even coming out of the mental hospital, I still had some reluctance towards the idea that I needed help. I used to be very confident in myself, in the sense like I'd be like, oh, like I can just fix myself by myself. I don't really need anybody else. I kind of cause a problem to myself. I'll fix it myself. And I think that's just kind of what goes wrong in therapy in general. Like if you're somebody who isn't genuine about the therapy, if you don't genuinely believe that you need help, if you don't genuinely want to get help and feel open to sharing that with a therapist, then I don't think you're actually going to get anything out of therapy. And while I would recommend therapy to everybody, because I think it is great, you learn so much insight and it really changes the way you think about how you live your life and how you see yourself, I don't think it's a good idea for people who essentially are not genuine about it, who don't authentically want to experience growth within themselves, who realize like you need to go through a lot of difficulties when you're in therapy. You have to talk about a lot of very ugly parts about yourself that if you're not honest about yet, like you're not going to get anything about therapy. Putting up a front to a therapist is like no different than putting up a front to the outside world. And when you talk to a therapist, you have to be like who you are at your very, very core. And if you're somebody who just hasn't gotten there yet, then it's okay. But I don't think you should like force therapy on yourself yet either, until you're at the point where you are comfortable being very honest about your flaws, being very honest about your struggles, and being very honest that like you're probably broken to a certain degree inside, and that you want to get help for whatever that brokenness is.
At 12 years old, when, first of all, like you mentioned, you haven't fully accepted the fact that you have mental health conditions, and you're forced to talk with someone that is a complete stranger. You don't know who they are, and your parents, who you may not have like the healthiest relationship with, are sitting there. It's not the most like comfortable setting
Yeah.
and environment to open up to. So, I mean, that was when you're 12 years old, and going on through your life, was there any point where you felt more comfortable talking with therapists?
I would say that after the mental hospital and after like my required sessions with a therapist, I really honestly stopped seeing a therapist after that. And a lot of it, while I talk about it being about yourself, you also have to make sure like you find a therapist who you feel very comfortable with. And it's not, you don't feel comfortable with the very first therapist you meet. It doesn't happen often. And so sometimes that does require you to, like go through different therapists, like see different ones, see who you genuinely feel comfortable with and do want to talk with. And I just thought like I didn't have the time to do that. I didn't really want to go through that process of like talking to a bunch of therapists, spilling out my life to like a ton of different people before figuring out who really felt like they could hear me and like listen to me. And so I just really didn't want to go through that process when I was going through high school. But I would say that last year in 2020, I was also going through a lot that summer. And, that was, I still wasn't very open to the idea of seeing a therapist, but a few of my friends had really, really pushed for me to see a therapist. And I decided, okay, it's middle of COVID. I don't really have anything better to do with myself at home. Might as well, start seeing a therapist again, because there's still a lot within myself that I've left unresolved and kind of just lived with for a while. And so I probably talked to at least like 5 different therapists every day for a while, just like talking to people, seeing how I felt with them, how they heard my story, how I was able to speak with them, until I was able to finally find a therapist who I still see even now, not as regularly on like a week to week basis, but more so just when I need to, I can reach out to him. And honestly, he's one of the best therapists, not one of the, like he is the best therapist that I've found so far, because he just matches my needs very well. And it's just the kind of person that I am, the kind of listening that I want from somebody, the kind of advice and insight, and the way he communicates it all with me, I found it to be very beneficial. It's just been exactly what I was looking for in therapy. But I really think, people shouldn't be discouraged if like the first few times they meet with a therapist, it doesn't feel right, because, maybe they're just not the right therapist for you. There's not your problem. It's not their problem. It just means it wasn't a good match. And so right now, I don't actively see a therapist, but I do know that if I ever need to, he's just a call away, and I can always schedule a time with him.
Mm-hmm. And do you recommend any therapists in particular?
Ooh, so that goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that while I could like recommend therapists to people, I also do believe a lot of it really is a discovery journey for yourself, figuring out who best works for you, because a therapist might be wonderful for all of your friends, but they might not be wonderful for you. And, once again, that's not your problem. That's not the therapist's problem. You just might have different forms of communication that you need, different forms of comfort that you're looking for. And so I generally actually tend to stay away from recommending therapists to people, because I don't want to like have any preconceived notion from anybody that I recommend to be like, oh, like Emily said they were a good therapist, but I don't really like them. Like, is something wrong with me instead then? So like I generally try to stay away from like recommending therapists in that form.
Yeah, that's perfectly okay. And I just want to ask, so going through that journey, what value did you get out of going through therapy?
So much. I think like the first thing that comes to mind, and probably the biggest, that is the encompassment of everything. It's just that you learn so much insight about yourself and how you grow up, really. At least that was what happened for me. I learned a lot about myself. I used to blame a lot on myself. I used to say like Emily, you're flawed, like this is your problem, you did this to yourself. But the more I was able to talk with my therapist, the more I came to realize that a lot of it really just has to do with, my upbringing, and like just the environmental factors I was near, just the kind of nurturing that I had as a child, and how they logically would become the kind of person that I am. He recommended some books to me that I did end up reading. And like the more I read the books, it felt like, first of all, like obviously I wasn't alone in this. And the fact that I'm not alone means that other people go through this, which means that, it's not just the me problem, it's a problem of my environment. It's a problem of just how I grew up. And it's not solely because I am a flawed human. It could just be because of flawed upbringing instead. And just being able to give that distance to myself and having that insight about how I grew up versus placing all the blame on myself, I think was very, very supportive for my own growth and allowed me to really kind of divorce myself from a lot of the problems I used to really just pin and staple and say that it was my identity.
Yeah. And on the opposite end of therapy, in talk therapy, there's medicine.
Mhm.
So after being hospitalized, or did you seek help through medicine? And if you did you find there was a hesitancy from either you or your parents to go down this path?
Definitely. So I also have an interesting history with medicine as well. When I was first diagnosed with depression, I was given medication by the general doctor that I was seeing. But because my parents were heavily against the idea that I had a mental disorder. They used to tell me that it was just my own problem and I was just wanted attention and I kind of made this problem for myself. They took the medication away from me. So I never actually got to have any of the medication that was prescribed just when I was still within my parents' household. But when I was at the mental hospital, I was given medication as well. And I did agree to take the medication. And honestly, like for me, like medication, I don't think did too much. And I know for some other people, medication really helps them, really supports them and gets them through the day. But for myself, I don't think medication did all that much. Like I took antidepressants essentially, but for me, antidepressants actually kind of made my situation worse because antidepressants also made it very hard for me to focus. And for me, I know it was a bit of a problem, but like being unable to focus at school only made me feel worse about myself. And so I had to get myself off the antidepressants because in a way they were just not helping me. And instead I found more comfort, just from like processing my emotions one step at a time instead of essentially trying to slow myself down throughout the day. And hopefully that helps to explain it. But normally I would tell people that I personally don't take medication myself, but if you find that it is something that helps you, then by all means do what you need to help yourself.
And you mentioned your parents weren't open to the idea of you getting medicine.
Mhm.
When you were going through like the hospitalization, did it help them accept the fact that you had mental health conditions? And was there ever a time where you had a conversation with them or you brought in external sources to help them understand and have that conversation?
Ooh, see, that's also a very interesting question to ask. I think when I was at the mental hospital, I don't think my parents were able to accept the fact that I had mental disorders, but instead being hospitalized showed them that I was going through something and they realized that it was serious, but they didn't fully accept what the problem was. Instead, like previously they used to just kind of say like, oh, you're just acting sad, like you're just being emotional, blah, 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 blah. But for me to end up in the hospital, I think that was what made them realize, like the emotions she's feeling are real and like they're actually really serious and very intense. But the root cause of those emotions, the mental disorders, I don't think even today they ever came to accept or believe or understand. And you did ask, like, have I ever like sat them down, like had a conversation with them about it? And I would say that I have like many times attempted to do so. And I have many times, tried to talk to them, like, this is why I am the way that I am. But it's a bit of an ugly conversation, very difficult conversation just to start out, because my parents, and not just my parents, and I'm sure many parents or children going through something similar, it almost feels like there's a sense of blame that there really isn't, but I can see why parents would feel that there is a sense of blame. When I tell my parents, I'm like this because growing up, this was the kind of value that was instilled in me because of like the way you guys raised me up. And that feels like, you're blaming your parents. And then they come back and say like, hey, like we gave you a roof over your head. We gave you 3 meals a day. Like you're just being ungrateful at this point. And so that was honestly where the conversations kept on going. And my parents were very stubborn. They didn't really, essentially, they weren't ever able to get past the point of you're just blaming us, and it was like, no, I'm like, honestly, yeah, you could say I'm blaming you because you guys are the parents responsible for raising me. But like, first of all, it's not your fault. Like you only raised me the way you knew how to raise me. I'm just letting you know, like, this is how it made me turn out. But I don't think my parents are able to get past that, that hurdle and that barrier of feeling like I was blaming them. Once again, I do attribute it to just generational differences. The fact that at least how my parents grew up, ego and face was definitely a lot more important to them. And so to them, to have like a child blame them for like their flaws, it's something that they can't really wrap their minds around. And so hand in hand with that, I don't think they're ever able to really wrap their minds around the fact that I have mental disorders as a result of my upbringing and of my childhood. And that conversation has never really ever come up for us. So in terms of dynamics of how we are now between my parents and I, we just kind of like never talk about it. And honestly, like that, obviously that's not ideal of a solution to be having. It's kind of more so like I call it a band-aid solution where it's not ideal, but it gets the job done. And so we just don't talk about my mental health situation. I don't really bring it up with them. I try not to let my mental health and my progress through it ever become a topic at the dinner table. And we just talk about everything else outside of mental health. And so far that's been able to help reconstruct a lot of our relationship, just staying away from that. Even though once again, I understand it's not ideal, but it's what gets us through the day, really.
Do you think it's possible to overcome the generational difference, like you mentioned, with mental health? I'm imagining a youth who's in the same position as you, who wants to open up to their parents, but they're not getting they're not getting the response they expected from their parents. And instead, their parents are, like you mentioned, telling you that you can't handle pressure, you're being a coward. How can like a kid in that situation open up to their parents? Is it possible to overcome this generational difference?
I want to say it's completely possible. Nothing is ever impossible in my opinion. But I think it's a very much an uphill battle, especially for this generation. I feel like we are the generation that has started the ball rolling on the mental health conversation. And for previous generations that probably didn't even have to think or know what mental health was, it's just something completely foreign to them. And so I think it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of education. It takes a lot of hand-holding to like show parents or show people from a different generation what our generation is pretty much like all about and what we want to support. And so I feel even for children who might be going through what I went through and might have parents similar to me, I think it takes a lot. Like it's definitely going to require a lot of heartache. It's going to take a lot of labor, a lot of difficulty, but I want to say it's possible. And I still have hope that's possible. Like I haven't given up either. Every now and then I try to talk to my parents about mental health. I would try to like subtly bring it up at the dinner table. I might mention like, hey, my therapist told me this the other day, just casually drop something like that and kind of gauge how they react to it. Like, even though right now I'm currently at a standstill with my parents with our temporary band-aid of a solution, like I haven't given up either. And I think it's also up to the children to not give up on that battle, because I think it's also really easy to accept and then believe that like, hey, my parents are the way that they are, so they're not going to ever listen to me. And, we're just going to leave it at that. I mean, if that's the solution to some people, then that's great for them. But I know for myself and maybe for many others out there, even though it's going to be a slow and difficult process, like if it's worth it to you to like keep having this kind of talks and like keep having these kinds of fights here and there, then like by all means go for it as well, which I don't think it's going to be impossible.
And going back to therapy and medicine,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to those types of like ways to help you get better, people also find things like journaling and
Mm-hmm.
meditation help. So did you ever use like any specific techniques? Like I know you mentioned previously that you practice journaling, and
Mm-hmm.
even within journaling, there are so many different techniques. Some people just like freestyle. They just let go of everything that's in their mind.
Mm-hmm.
Some people like to practice writing what they're grateful for and write 3 things I'm grateful for every day. And some
Mm-hmm.
people like to follow different journal prompts. So were there any specific techniques you used when it came to journaling? And in addition, any other strategies that you use to manage your mental health?
So I think all of these come down to just different coping mechanisms that people can find in their lifestyles. And once again, just like I want to preface stuff like this is what worked for me. And obviously nothing's ever a one size fits all when it comes to mental health. But for myself, like you did mention, I do journal very much. And especially when I was kind of going through my roughest times, I found that journaling was the easiest way for me to communicate my emotions, whether that was to myself, to my therapist, to my friends. Honestly, like writing it out in words was so much easier for me than keeping it all bottled up in my head. Because to me, it's like when you keep thoughts in your head, they're very nebulous. Like you don't think in English. You just think thoughts, and that makes it very easy for your thoughts to spiral downwards. It makes it very easy for your thoughts to get very, very emotional very quickly. But I find that when I'm writing them down in like actual cohesive English statements and sentences, that helps me slow down. That helps me process a lot of thinking more so than like letting them kind of get out of control in my own head. So when I journal in particular, I make it a point not to journal too much about what happened throughout my day, but more so about how I felt throughout my day. So maybe I would say that this one event made me feel really happy. And so I would spend less time writing about what the event was and more so like why that made me feel happy, like what parts of it made me feel happy. Similarly, something didn't make me feel so great that day. I didn't want to write as much about what happened that day, but more so like why I felt the way that I felt in reaction. And I think that was able to provide a lot of insight even to myself, because I found that even as I was writing, I was learning so much more about myself. I was like, wow, I see trends in myself, sometimes, because I'm the kind of person who I can't just like sit down at one time in the day and journal. I journal whenever throughout the day. Just whenever I feel like I'm having emotions or thoughts that I want to keep, I'll journal whenever. And I can like look back sometimes and I'll be like, wow, like I'm starting to realize, like I seem more negative during the morning times or just, something around those lines. And I might try to implement other coping mechanisms to help myself get around that. And so those are the kind of coping mechanisms I found within journaling itself. Other coping mechanisms for me, like everyone says, like exercise is great, and I completely agree. Just as somebody who's also recovering from anorexia, exercise I think has been one of the most liberating things I've been able to do for myself. Really gets you out of your head, because a lot of the times when it comes to mental health and just mental wellness, it's all in our head. And sometimes when you aren't feeling so great because of your mental health, it's likely because you're spending too much time in your head and thinking too much about what's going on inside your head. And exercise, to me, it just really releases you from all of that. You're focusing on something else. You're focusing on your body. You're focusing on how tired you're feeling. You're just focusing on anything else besides what's going on in your head. And so exercise has been really wonderful for me. I would say something else that I also enjoy doing is art. I've always done art a lot since I was a kid. To me, it's just been very expressive. And to me, like, I practice most forms of art that are visual. So it could be anything from like sculpture to painting to sketching and anything along those sorts. And for me, just being able to kind of release my emotions in ways other than language has been very beneficial. So instead of journaling and getting my emotions out, I can be expressive and almost abstract with it in art. That was a very different form of a coping mechanism as well.
It's really cool how all of these different coping mechanisms you mentioned they're very different, from exercising to journaling, to like expressing your feelings through art. But at the end of the day, they still help you. And it's awesome.
One of the things that you mentioned was you were a class valedictorian, but at high school, but at many points through high school, you were asked to drop out. How did that make you feel, to be forced or to be asked to drop out? And who was telling you to actually drop out of school?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. Like, so it wasn't just high school, but definitely college as well. Many points was asked to drop out. And I think definitely when I was in high school, I felt like, coming out of the mental hospital, I think the mental hospital really, really changed me. And, just the person I was before the mental hospital and after are two completely different people in how I approach my mental health. So when I was asked to drop out of the high school, or asked to just drop out in general, or like go home for a while, like get inpatient care, et cetera, essentially like stop my studies for an extended period of time, it was all after the mental hospital. Because, like obviously a student's been gone for a while, like they start realizing like why the student is gone is for mental health purposes. Once again, I did come from the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, where mental health really wasn't a conversation that was encouraged. And so, when I returned to school, I was called into the principal's office very, very often. I was called into admin office very, very often, just so they can be like, hey, like, are you doing okay? Like, are you sure you don't want to like leave school or like whatever? And, I'm not saying that this was their intention, but to me, it felt more like they just didn't want to have me as a liability, as somebody who was mentally unstable and like labeled mentally unstable. I felt like I was just a liability to them. And I felt like they just wanted me to like not be at school in case, something happened. Because you hear like stories of people who go to mental hospitals. You don't hear like straight A students going to mental hospitals. You hear like the crazy people, you hear like the weirdos going to the mental hospital. And I'm sure like that was the label that I got for a while from my school. They were scared like, oh, what if she does something crazy or insane and like hurts another student? But that wasn't me. And so to me, the fact that my school seemed to have given me that impression, I'm not trying to like label and say that this was what they thought, but this was just how I really perceived all of it. For me to feel like my school was treating me that way, it was like, wow, like it really didn't feel like they cared about me. Like that wasn't why they wanted me to leave school. It was more so like they didn't want to end up on national news for a student doing something crazy in school. And so I really was very resistant to that idea, and almost a sense of defiance, where it was like, no, I'm going to refuse to do this because I know you want me to do it. I'm going to refuse to do it and prove you all completely wrong, and prove you all that like I'm not crazy and that I am completely capable of myself, that I can like still hold myself up high despite like having all these disorders, despite still recovering through a lot, and despite being like one of the worst cases my school has seen. Like I'm still not gonna let you guys like label me or kind of put me away in a box that everyone seems to perceive of mental hospital patients. That's what happened in high school. In college, I was also told to go home many times. So that was because of anorexia, and that was more so for my physical well-being at that point. So it's a bit different than when it came to college.
Right. And yeah, let's touch upon anorexia, right? You've gone to the point where, what was that trigger to starve, or at least that's how I see, starve yourself from food? Is it body image issues?
Even though anorexia was worse for me in college, I already started struggling with eating disorders back in high school. So I was quite bulimic in high school, where, instead of not eating and starving yourself like anorexia is, I would throw up my food after meals. And so, because living with parents, it's harder to get away with not eating, but instead it's easier to get away with going upstairs to the toilet and throwing up your food after dinner. And so that's what I did throughout like my junior and senior years of high school. Where it all came from, I would say it was quite a multitude of places. First of all, just like I mentioned earlier that I was sexually harassed when I was 12 years old, but that wasn't the only situation when I had to occur something like that. And so, after it had happened a few more times, I started to just really kind of hate my body, just really hate being in my body. It just felt very tarnished and dirty. And I just really hated existing in it. I wanted to do everything I could essentially to kind of like, I don't know, it's really hard to explain, but it's just like get rid of myself and my body of sorts. And so it's like, I want to starve this body. I didn't want this body to live. I didn't want this body to do well. Along with the fact that like I had very strained relationships with my brother, there were points when I mentally wasn't doing so great, and I would just hate the fact that I was related to my brother or that we shared the same blood. Once again, just contributed to the idea that I didn't want this body to be doing well. Like I hated being in this body. My need to always be productive also really contributed to it, because I would see it then as like, oh, why should I waste time eating and getting fat if instead I could be studying and doing more? And so mentally, that was one avenue I took. And as I just kind of hinted at, a lot of it was also body image issues. A lot of it was feeling like, first of all, not other feeling I was good enough, and then realizing that, oh, I wasn't even skinny enough. I used to be very athletic. I used to always enjoy like playing around in PE. I used to enjoy being on a sports team and always being very athletic and very active. But, since like I started adolescence, since I started puberty, as people made more comments about my body, like, wow, Emily, like you're so skinny, or like, in the East Asian culture, people make jokes like, oh, like you need to lose some more weight, like eat less. Like those are just jokes that are pretty common in East Asian culture. But as somebody kind of growing up around like these kinds of mental health issues, it hit me a lot harder than some people might have expected. And so I would say it was a culmination of a lot of different kinds of fears and factors that ended up, to me, logically just being like, like, why eat them? Like, you don't need to eat. Like, you're fine. Like, don't eat. And so that's what happened in college. It was like in college when restrooms are more shared, like I didn't really want to throw up in them anymore. So it just ended up becoming not eating at all. Mm-hmm.
And how is your relationship with food right now? Have you come to a point where you actually are embracing food? I would love to understand your story, the after story as well. So just for our viewers, you've gone through elementary school, through high school, you even finished university and got into McKinsey, which is one of the hardest organizations to get into. So your story of resilience has, I don't like to call it a happy ending, but it's a story of resilience. There are paths in life that could have taken you in many different ways, but you've been resilient through circumstances and through your own resiliency to get to this point. So before we touch on how you got into McKinsey, talk to me about your relationship with food right now.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, like, thank you so much. I really appreciate all of that there. And I like to just say that it's a story that's still ongoing. But yeah, when it comes to food, I have a very complicated relationship with food now, because I mean, it's really hard to explain if you aren't somebody who's kind of gone through an eating disorder as well, but I'll try my best here. Like essentially when you starve your body, and so in the period when I was super anorexic, I was probably eating like 2 meals a week, and I probably didn't die because I was just taking a ridiculous amount of supplements every day for like my vitamins and minerals and like other nutritions, but that was all I took during those days. And so when you starve your body of that for so long, your mind, and like just as humans who, once again, it's not great to say, but we are animals. At the end of the day, we are operated to survive. And so when you starve your body like that, you just become obsessed with food. I remember like I loved cooking for my friends. I loved being near food. I loved like learning recipes and like going to like nice restaurants or seek nice restaurants. But I just hated ever eating that food. And so like I became obsessed with food, you know, and like all my friends used to joke that I was like the cooking mama of our dorm, you know, because I was like always cooking and like making food for everybody else but myself. And like that's very true even now. Like even as somebody who's still in recovery from anorexia, I am still very much essentially like obsessed and in love with food. You know, I love just the idea of food. I love like celebrating food with people, you know, having friends surrounding your table with food. And so like I would say that I really like food, and like even a lot of my friends and even my coworkers joke that I'm like the one who always knows all the restaurant recommendations to go everywhere because I've probably read all the menus already. Like things like that. But even though like I think this is the common appearance I may give off, it's still a very complicated relationship under the surface, in the sense that like I right now am not allowed to know the calories of my food, and I very, very actively try not to know the calories of what I intake. Just as somebody who also has a background in math, it's very easy for me to see calories, start adding them up on instinct, like without even willingly wanting it to happen. I start adding up my calories and start calculating like, oh, you've eaten too much, or oh, you've eaten too little. I just really try to stay away from that. And so I try to stay away from like knowing my calories. And oftentimes, maybe not even oftentimes, but more often than not, I'm always thinking about like every bite of food I'm taking. I'm still second guessing myself a lot, you know, being like, oh, like, should I be taking another bite? Because another thing of anorexia is that essentially when you starve yourself, like when you starve your body to the point that I starved myself, you lose your hormones of feeling hunger and satiety. And even right now, I'm probably 2 years from recovery right now, but even now I still lack a lot of those hormones, and I see that very often. I probably like need to not eat for a whole day, like a whole 24 hours before I start feeling hunger at all. And at this like the opposite end, I can eat like 4,000 calories in a meal and still not feel full. And so I think like that only makes it harder as an anorexic to recover, because you now don't have those bodily instincts to tell you to eat or tell you to stop eating. And so I find myself now very commonly obsessing over like, oh, am I eating too much of a portion size? Because I can't tell for myself anymore, you know? And I actually serve as a server in restaurants on the weekends, and I used to do it throughout college. And I think that really helped me because, you know, working in a restaurant, you're always surrounded by like portions of food. And I've instilled rules in my life that do make me eat. So I have like a rule that if my friends invite me to eat with them, I am not allowed to say no. Like I need to have a meal with them, or like I need to at least confirm with them that I am eating. They're all kind of just measures I put in my life just to make sure that I'm still eating on days when I might not want to.
I mean, you're being authentic and saying, no, you're not completely overcoming it, but there are ways to manage and have a support system. In your case, you know, you have a good support system who can, I don't want to use the word monitor, but I actually manage how you eat, right? Manage how you eat so that you stay healthy, and they do care for you. So that's wonderful that you have friends like that. And a lot of people need to have a core group of friends like that. So let's go to happy time. So we talked about, you know, I mean, there's happy and there's sad times, but let's talk about, you know, you getting your job at McKinsey. How did that even unfold? Because this is one of the toughest consulting agencies to get a job in. What did they like? How was the interview process? Did they know about your story before they hired you? Do they know about your story right now? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, very good questions. I'm not going to bore you with my recruiting process and like how all the interviews and all that went, but long story short, McKinsey isn't very well aware of my mental situation, but it is not something that I hide, essentially. You know, it's just not really come up in conversation yet here at McKinsey. I do plan to be very involved with our mental health efforts here, to just be, once again, like very open about my story. And my door is always open if people ever want to talk about it. I don't like actively plug myself into conversations like that, but if somebody ever wants to have a conversation around it, like I'm always here to talk about it, and I'm not going to like hide it. I'm not going to like deny it, or like I don't think it's going to affect my professional career. And if it does, then like maybe that's not the professional career for me, and that's just kind of how I think of it. Retroactively, I look back to how I was last year. I also had a suicide attempt last year, and I look to myself and I'm like, hey, like, to me from 2020, like, you would have no idea where you're going to end up in 1 year. Like, if you told me a year ago that I'd be at McKinsey, that I'd be in a much happier place in my life and I'd be working on a lot, I wouldn't believe you. But hey, look what happened.
And you admitted to even considering just last year to commit suicide, or you attempted suicide again and again. Was that, what was that point now that you come to? Is it that you did not get what you wanted, or you just felt low, and that's what got you to that path again?
Oh, definitely. So last year it was just because it was the summer of COVID. And so there was a lot just going on in my life because of the pandemic, financially, with family, mental health, being away from school, health, etc. There's just a lot going on. And to me at that point, it just felt like there was so much coming in every which direction. And because the pandemic is so unpredictable, like when we were in the peak of it, we didn't know when it was going to end. And so for me, like, even if I try to tell myself, like, have hope for the future, I was like, when's the future? Like, when is this pandemic going to end? Like, is it going to end? And because the pandemic had driven a lot of like negativity into my life, I think the fact that we just didn't have any hope, or like we didn't know where the pandemic was going, that just mentally dragged me down a lot.
Yeah, the pandemic definitely did that. And I know a lot of teens who openly talked about, how the pandemic affected their mental health, because they're so used to going to school and being surrounded by people, and that was their lifeline. And all of a sudden that lifeline was also removed.
Definitely.
It almost felt constricted. So I've heard stories like that. We just have to acknowledge that mental health is as important as physical health.
Like, I think it's very cliche, but take your breaks. Like, take your breaks, whether that is sleeping. I am much more like on my sleep schedule now than I used to be in high school. I've come to realize just how important sleep is for my mental health. And so definitely keeping a regulated sleep schedule for myself. Also making sure that like I'm finding the time to balance my social life, because at the end of the day, humans are social. And I'm also an introvert just by default. So I do appreciate my alone time. At the end of the day, social time is also very helpful for me sometimes, just to get out of my own head. So I make sure that I dedicate enough time to my social life as well. When previously I didn't really care too much for it, I used to think it was a waste of time. I'm now realizing that it's actually very helpful for me, and it's very beneficial that I'm not just talking to myself on a wall sometimes. And so I practice that a lot now too. I would also just say that like throughout my day, at least just when it comes to me and my working style, I make sure that I'm not sitting down, or I make sure I'm not like focused on one same thing for over an hour at a time. I know that like it just gets too much in my head, and I'm not able to find any mental clarity within myself. So even if I'm just journaling, even if I'm just like reading, even if I'm sitting at the desk, I try to break up what I do every day just to like keep my mind active. And so I don't find myself essentially giving myself an excuse or a possibility to find a mental rut to go down. And so that's more active in my day. Also want to say, kind of interesting, but I do make sure that dessert is more of an active part of my day now, which like I think just as an anorexic is a part of like my recovery process to be more okay with sweets and sugar again, but also like makes me happy to eat now. When I just eat in general now, I do have the practice of I'm not allowed to be doing anything else when I'm eating. It's just time to like have a mental break and to just be focusing on my food and focusing on eating and focusing on the people that I'm eating with. I used to always like be on my laptop at the same time, like watching a lecture or like doing some work at the same time. But I found that we could all spare just like 30 minutes for lunch break. We can all spare like 30 minutes to an hour for dinner. Like we'll still be okay. And those just like forcibly instilling those kinds of breaks throughout my day, I think has just overall helped me really much. And among like everything else I've already mentioned for coping mechanisms, art, exercise, all that jazz, I still practice as much as I can.
And kudos to the dessert. I am a dessert. I love my dessert. My family makes fun of me.
It's required.
Well, to me, it's just not really required. I could exercise a wee bit more to counter the amount of desserts that I have, but hey, go for it. Enjoy yourself. Hey, one life. Are there any books or YouTube channels or any sort of other, thank you for sharing, the resources that you use, but are there any books or YouTube channels or podcasts that you can also recommend to our viewers?
Yeah, definitely. So I mostly read books instead of like podcasts or YouTube channels. So I can't recommend too much on those two fronts. When it comes to books, I think one of the first books I read on mental health was called Toxic Parents. I don't remember the author, but like I think if you just look up Toxic Parents, there's not many books called Toxic Parents. So that book was really great in just helping me kind of divorce my problems from myself and more so realize that they're attributed to just the way I grew up, which I think once again very super helpful to my mental development. So I recommend that book. There's a book I'm going through right now. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. Essentially, it's a book that talks about how physical trauma or just how physiological trauma can end up like affecting mental trauma or like vice versa, and how like you can see exactly how the effects of physical trauma could affect you years later mentally, or how exercising is a really great coping mechanism and like where those benefits come from. And so I'm somebody who really appreciates like approaching mental topics from a scientific perspective as well, just kind of like break down like mentally, scientifically, why we are the way that we are. And so these books do a really great job of breaking them down. And then lastly, there's another book I am working on. It's called How to Think Like a Monk. And that book in particular is more so of a positive book. And instead, it just teaches you how to be more appreciative of your everyday life, teaches you about how to be more happy about just the lifestyle that you're leading. And so off the top of my head, those would be 3 books I would recommend there.
And I'm also to understand that you are writing a memoir called Everything I Leave Behind for You. So if you could just share a little bit about what you're writing and when you're hoping to publish it.
Oh, definitely. Thank you so much. I am publishing in December 2021. I actually am launching the pre-orders either today or tomorrow. So it's been a crazy busy time trying to get that ready. Yep, we are hitting a deadline there. And so, yeah, the book is called Everything I Leave Behind for You. It is a book of essentially my experiences in mental health, less so of what I've been through and more so of the lessons that I've learned from it that I'm hoping to pass on to others. And I think the way I talk about it with other people is that I've been told many times that I've gone through a lot more experiences than most 21-year-olds have gone through when it comes to mental health. And I think because of these experiences, I've come out as a much stronger, as a much more resilient person, to whatever life throws at me now. I think I approach them so much better than I would have had I not gone through these experiences. But at the same time, I don't want anybody else to go through what I did. And so I'm hoping that this book, which captures a lot of my thoughts, a lot of my learning, will be able to share with other people what I've been able to learn about life and how I live life now without them needing to experience what I did, for them to be able to grow the way that I did without all of the struggles that I had gone through. And so it's a book that there's a lot of writings about like lessons I think of, lessons I learned, conversations I have with people, conversations with therapists. But in the book, I'm also including a part of my journal that I had written last year, especially when I was going through a mentally difficult time in my life, just to give people perspective that like, this is when I'm at my mental worst, when other people are at their mental worst, like this is how they think, these are the thoughts that go through their head. And, like, first of all, like you're not alone, but if you don't experience these, like maybe you could sympathize or empathize with somebody else who does. And so it's a very packed book. Right now I only have the manuscript. I still need to wait for an editor to get back to me with a bajillion edits that I need to make. And so we'll see where the book turns out by December, but I am on track to publishing in about 5 months there.
Oh my God. And I'm really excited to see that, and definitely will get a copy of that. I mean, just listening to you talk and share your journey so authentically and so immersed into your journey, and the fact that you're so resilient and you've come out of it so resilient. And yeah, you're not an ordinary 21-year-old. I noticed that 20-year-olds are starting to get, or I feel the maturity, but for a 21-year-old, I feel like I'm talking to a 30-year-old soul.
Thank you.
If you can share with the audience why it's important to be resilient and why why it's important to not lose hope. What's that advice to that kid who's like, I'm done with life. I am done with this. This is just not worth it. Why is it important to be resilient?
like life doesn't get better unless you're alive. And as stupid as that sounds, like that's something I held on to for a very long time. Even if there was just the smallest hope that things could get better, and like if even just like 1% of hope was against like 99% of doubts and like suicidal emotions, I would tell myself, like, why not give that 1% a chance? Just go to sleep tonight, wake up again tomorrow. Let's see how you feel tomorrow. And about the very least, you don't have to commit to like living for 50 more years. Just commit to sleeping tonight and waking up again tomorrow morning. So one step at a time. You can't get better. Like you literally cannot get better unless you're alive. And so if you have just any amount of hope at all, like keep holding on to that hope, because it's what's going to keep you alive and get you to your furthest places. I look back now and I wish I could have told the younger me that like, you're going to be okay. And like, you're going to look back in a few months, a few weeks, a few years, maybe a few decades. You're going to realize that you were a lot more okay than you thought you were. And you're going to be a lot more okay than you think. And that's also been what's been getting through. Like, that's what's been helping me get through a lot of difficult times as well. It's the idea that I want that future me to have the opportunity to look back and think like, hey, I'm glad you like stuck through it. And I'm glad you didn't give up then, even though you so wanted to give up. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I like to think of, because so like, I feel like almost anybody could look back in their lives and find a point where they thought they were at rock bottom and then think like, hey, I'm glad you didn't give yourself up to rock bottom. I'm glad that you kept going because you were a lot more okay than you thought you were. And so the fact that like, I just try to give my future self that hope. And as you can see, I keep coming back to the idea of hope. I think I was somebody who didn't grow up with a lot of hope. I didn't understand what it was. I thought it was just like corny, like sayings that people put on their walls and dinner time or whatever. Like hope is so important. And even if you just have 1% of that hope, it's like, it's what keeps you going. So hold on to it as far as you can.
So great job again, being resilient and coming out of it. And I know it's a continuous journey for you, where you authentically share that you are still battling mental health, and it is a continuous journey. You have come to accept it, but you're at a point where you can talk to yourself and say, hey, this is my low. Let me just sleep on it and let me wake up the next day and deal with the next day. And you've got your surrounding support system as well. Emily, again, thank you so much for sharing your journey so authentically, so openly with us, because I am sure whoever listens to this and someone who is currently in a situation that you were in will resonate with it and will find hope through this interview. So thank you so much again, Emily, for doing it. Of course.
Thank you so much for listening and having me here. I really enjoyed this. And thank you for being open to, starting these conversations with people like me.
Yeah, thank you.